Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And welcome to the session titled Relational Governance, State Capacity, and Sustainable Land Use Across the Tropics. My name is Marius. I'm a postdoc at UCLA, and I'm the organizer of today's session and also one of the speakers. Before we dive into presentations, I just want to say a big thank you to the GLP team and all the organizers for putting together this wonderful event. And of course, a big thank you to all of you for taking your time to join us, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations and your thoughts and comments on the topic. We have an hour and a half schedule. We're obviously running a little bit late, but each presentation will be between 10 and 15 minutes with a couple of minutes for Q&A, and if we do end up a little early, I think we can all give ourselves some extra time back before the lunch break. We are very fortunate to have three fantastic speakers and myself today, and we're all going to be looking at different aspects and challenges related to the governance of land systems. We'll be starting with Yifan Flora He. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Santa Barbara, and she will share her research on the political economy of deforestation in Bolivia. And Flora's work examines how deforestation is used as a patronage tool by political actors and the implication this has for environmental governance and policy enforcement. After Flora, we'll have Gabriel Suchodolski. He's a postdoctoral associate at the Georgetown University, and he will discuss land policy and governance in the Brazilian Amazon. And his ethnographic work sheds some light on how civil society and elites impact the functioning of land bureaucracies, offering some lessons how different political dynamics can impact and hinder or enhance governance effectiveness. Then it's my turn. I'll be presenting on a recent research piece on the challenges of using remote sensing for environmental governance in the tropics, specifically looking at the challenges encountered by on-the-ground users, civil servants, indigenous communities, and local community members. And then last but certainly not least is going to be Joss Lyons-White. He's a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Cambridge, and he will present on the role of private sector commitments to zero deforestation, and his research examines how these commitments operate within global supply chains and the ways in which public governance contexts influence their effectiveness. And I think we're having a great selection of speakers who look at the complex challenges of land system governance in the tropics. And I'm very much looking forward to the presentations and the discussions that we'll hopefully have after this, and all of your thoughts and comments on the topics as well. And once again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Flora, who will kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. I just want to apologize in advance because that clicker doesn't work, so you hear me say next a lot of times. Siguiente, por favor. Siguiente. Yes. Okay. Tropical deforestation is a global problem, and we know that forest protection policies are widely adopted across the globe, but they are insufficiently enforced, and that affects siguiente. So they affect our progress towards climate mitigation as well as livelihood for forest-dependent communities. Siguiente. This is the most. Okay, so previous work on the drivers of low enforcement of forest laws have looked at issues such as the lack of capacity and corruption and flawed policy design. However, in my work, in my work, I'm looking at an additional mechanism, which is political patronage. So that means I'm looking at the process in which party politicians distribute state benefits in exchange for electoral support. So more specifically, I'm asking whether political alignment between municipal governments and the central government affect how forest laws are enforced in Bolivia. In other words, does electing an aligned mayor or a mayor from the same party as the central government affect forest law enforcement in that municipality? So broadly, I'm interested in understanding whether deforestation is used as patronage, as well as the mechanisms of its use. So previous work have pointed to patronage being important because we are seeing a higher rate of deforestation during competitive elections. However, a big challenge of past work is that it is extremely difficult to observe political processes. So most studies have used the overall deforestation rate to infer these processes. So one of the big contributions of this paper is that I'm able to overcome the data challenge by using a novel enforcement data set to directly examine two mechanisms. The first one is deliberate non-enforcement, or forbearance, as Alicia Holland calls it. And the second one is legalization, or authorization of illegal deforestation. Legal deforestation. So if deforestation is used as patronage tool, I am also interested in understanding whether land users strategically respond by changing their deforestation behavior. And I built my case in Bolivia, which is an important and understudied case. So Bolivia actually has one of the highest cover of primary forests in the world, as well as one of the highest biodiversity levels. However, in recent years, it is ranked third globally for primary forest loss, despite its relatively small size. And the deforestation in Bolivia is primarily driven by the expansion of agricultural commodities. And a lot of these illegal activities affect indigenous lands as well as protected areas. So it is actually somewhat puzzling to see these level of environmental degradation in Bolivia, because Bolivia has one of the most stringent forest laws in the region. The 1996 forest law promotes sustainable forest management and prescribes limitations for deforestation. And Bolivia has been governed by the Movement for Socialism Party, MAS, which has been incumbent since the election of Evo Morales, who is the first indigenous president of Bolivia. And the MAS party has long been an advocate for pro-indigenous and pro-environment policies. However, in more recent years, observer has shown that the party has moved towards favoring agribusiness. So the main actors in the realm of forest law enforcement include the MAS government, which directly controls the National Forest Agency, who is responsible for deforestation enforcement across the country. And there are municipalities that are aligned with the MAS government, meaning that they have a MAS mayor, and then there are municipalities that are unaligned, meaning they have an opposition mayor. So forest agency directly enforces laws with the land users in these municipalities. If the government distributes deforestation as patronage, I would expect to see less sanction and more legalization in the aligned municipalities. And if land users strategically respond, then I would expect to see more illegal deforestation in the aligned municipalities. So to test these hypotheses, I am using a causal inference method called closed election regression discontinuity design. It is widely used in political science and economics, including in the study of political drivers of deforestation. So I'm going to give you an intuition, without going into the estimation equation, I'm giving you an intuition behind this methodology. So remember, the question I'm asking is, does mayor alignment affect forest law enforcement and land user behavior? Now, if we naively compare municipalities that always vote for MAS or always vote for the opposition, that will be biased. Why? A lot of these municipalities that are either aligned or unaligned, they are actually quite different. So MAS municipalities tend to be at higher elevation, have less forests, they're poorer, and they're more rural. So municipalities are with close elections, meaning that MAS wins or loses with a small voting margin. They're actually more similar to each other. And here is an example of when I trim the sample to a voting margin of 10%, we can see that the covariates overlap considerably so that they are more similar and more comparable to each other. So that is how RDD, like the basic intuition behind an RDD. So it leverages the similarity among closed election municipalities. So we start with a full sample, and then we're going to trim the sample to only closed elections. After that, we can estimate, we can fit two polynomials on each side, and then look at the discontinuity at the cutoff, and that will be our estimation of the local average treatment effect. So in addition to this causal inference methodology, I also conducted over 40 interviews, primarily with the forest agency staff, to understand the context and to triangulate evidence. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using a novel enforcement database from the country that has spatial temporal data on the authorization and sanction of deforestation at the property level. So because of constraint of time, I'm not going to go into how I construct the outcome variable, but I want to show you, essentially, I'm looking at deforestation authorization area. I'm looking at sanction rate for illegal deforestation and the proportion of illegal deforestation out of the total deforestation area as my outcome variable. And I aggregate these results by municipality, which is the level of analysis. Now, so jumping into the results, I do find evidence that deforestation is deliberate, or there's deliberate non-enforcement of forest laws as a mechanism for political patronage. Because when a municipality closely elects an aligned mayor, we see that the enforcement rates reduces from about 1.5% to 0. And you can, it may not be easy to see from the regression discontinuity design plot because the overall deforestation rate is low, but let me convince you that the estimate of local average treatment effect is below 0 and it's significant. So I did not find evidence for the second mechanism, which is legalization. In fact, the municipalities that are aligned have slightly lower legalization or authorization area compared to unaligned municipality, which is contradicting my prediction. However, through interviews, I understood from the perspective of land users, legalization is not a preferred mechanism because it is a really time-consuming and costly process to hire somebody, a professional, to do the permitting. So this is not a preferred mechanism for obtaining state benefits. So in terms of evidence for strategic response by land users, I do see that land users, when they face lower sanction, they engage in more illegal deforestation. And as you can see from the clear jump in the cutoff, the illegal deforestation rate increases by about 10%. So I would argue that this result is actually consistent with the previous result because essentially when facing lower enforcement, land users are applying for fewer permits and they are engaging in more illegal activities. So I don't have time to go into the robustness checks, but the results are robust to a series of tests. And I also looked at additional results in terms of the targeting of patronage and the timing of patronage, which I'm happy to talk about at the Q&A. And I think I won't have time for the qualitative results, so I'll jump through these slides. But overall, I think the policy message is quite clear. So international aid agencies and policy reformers tend to focus on capacity building. They spend millions of dollars increasing the capacity for Ministry of Environment, for these enforcement agencies. But this result is showing that if we don't address the political incentives behind non-enforcement, capacity building may not solve all of the problems. And instead, we need to think about how to build more resilient institutions that are more autonomous and less dependent on central government and who is in power in terms of a political party. So this work also directly informs some of the current policy reforms in Bolivia. I'm working with a lot of colleagues who are trying to promote more like stronger sanctions and more autonomous forest agencies to support this like more robust enforcement of forest laws in Bolivia. So with that, I would like to thank a lot of people who support this work, and thank you so much for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions or chat afterwards. Thank you for your time.
I'm just going to pass the microphone around and start here.
Thank you so much for your work and also for a really wonderful presentation. My question is to give you a little bit more room to talk about what does an autonomous bureaucratic institution in Bolivia that could provide enforcement look like? Just to give some more details.
So what I'm finding, the results I skipped over in terms of like qualitative interviews, one of the biggest things that people have noted is that the forest agency was very technocratic and autonomous when it started in 1997. And people had a sense of nostalgia of this time because the hiring practices were determined by the forest agency itself, and they were really hiring people who are passionate about sustainable forestry. Now, after the reform in 2009, when the Mas government merged the forest agency with the land use agency, it started to become more dependent on the central government, and that is reflected in the hiring process, in how they implement policies. So I think like that contrast, and actually Bolivia in early 2000s was one of the countries that are pioneers in sustainable forest certificates. So you can see how at that time, like, it was a really strong model of sustainable forest management. So I think a lot of the changes that we are trying to advocate for is maybe more less dependency on the central government, like the budget. There are a lot of budget issues that can be more separated, and then the hiring practices need to be fundamentally reformed, because right now it's very political. They only hire staff that are backed by a campesino organization, which is a mass-aligned organization. Yeah.
Thank you, Flora. Very nice presentation, and cool and very relevant results for geography where not so many people study deforestation at the moment. So I was wondering about this process of moving people from the altiplano to the lowlands, giving them land. Deforestation happens through that, and that should happen particularly in the places where there are close elections, if that is politically motivated, which some people in Bolivia think it is. So I'm just wondering how, was that a covariate, or would your results be something that we could compare to movements of people, and it would help to explain that? So if you could say a little bit on that.
Yeah. So like in terms of the big context is government is trying to move people from the highland, which is the traditional political base of Mas, to the lowland to change the electoral map. And we are seeing some of the effects by just looking at how the electoral map has transitioned. There's increasing support in the lowland for Mas in the more recent elections. In this particular study, I did not use, I had a specification with covariates, but for the regression discontinuity design, for the most part, we are using the design itself to kind of identify the effects. So I think that would be, it will be interesting to kind of do a heterogeneous effect exploration to see whether migration or the proportion of campesino land is affecting the results. But right now, I don't have the answer. Yeah, but I do think that's a big, important dynamic in Bolivia that relates to deforestation.
Okay, thank you. I have my question would be: did you only study? I'm Sebastian Boya from Switzerland. Okay. So my question would be: did you exclusively study the period in which the Mas was in power, or did you also include the 2020 alternative time, or perhaps the time before? And do you think other parties would also do the same, or is it something specific from the Mas?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. So how generalizable are the results if I'm only studying mass period? First of all, the data is restricted to the mass period. I actually didn't have enforcement data for 2020, so I'm currently in the process of looking at annual reports to kind of glean that data. So it is a study focused on mass period, and I would answer your question about opposition leader in two ways. Okay, I know there are many surprises. Yeah, so first of all, 2020, during the interviews, I was able to it got worse in terms of the lack of autonomy of the agency. That was a time when they started requiring political backing for employment. So they purged all the mass staff and they recruited new staff. So I would not be surprised if I see the same patronage mechanism during an opposition leader. And then the second thing I want to say is mass is not that different from the opposition, even though they have this narrative of pro-environment, pro-indigenous. They are still a very clientelistic party, and they are representative of a lot of other Latin American parties, even the left-wing parties who have environmental platforms, but they actually do not deliver those promises. So I think in the more traditional agribusiness party, you probably will see more of this, but this is something that I do want to test, and I'm currently building a database for Brazil, which then we have the transition of power, and we can look at those dynamics there. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. Good morning. So I'm Gabriel Suchodolski. I'm actually from Brazil, though it says US here. I'm a postdoc researcher at Georgetown University at the Earth Commons Institute. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my work that I did over my dissertation and continue to develop. And it's about weak bureaucracies and land policy implementation in Amazonia. And I might not have to emphasize this, but this is critical. Bureaucracies and land policy shape land use dramatically, and Amazonia is a critical region for this because it's a global climate tipping point, and especially the Brazilian Amazon takes up most of that. But the findings, I think, kind of in line with what Ifan just talked about, of weak bureaucracies apply to other places in the world where bureaucracies are weak, land policy implementation is very erratic, and so this paper is basically trying to advance state performance theory, which is another word for governance, but focused on the consequences of governance. And it's going beyond state capacity, which basically states that you need trained bureaucrats with a good budget, and then they're able to do stuff. But that is kind of elusive in most of the world, and I try to get at explanations of what these weak bureaucracies can do, and it varies dramatically when it interacts with civil society actors, which are very heterogeneous across the world. And so I'm looking at land legibility policies, which a term borrowed from James Scott, is the simplification of a complex reality into a simplified, centralized information system of land cadastres, registry, and property titles. And land titles are interesting because they're the official recognition of a land property claim. And that provides an additional layer of protection for the land claimant, potentially access to credit, investment in land plots, and environmental management. So it's a necessary condition for sustainable development, though it's far from a sufficient condition. So what could explain state performance in land legibility and land titling. And there's a range of theories for this. One is high land rent, but basically neoclassical economic theory of land, which is valuable land use and connectivity to markets will make land users come into some sort of agreement and create property arrangements. Another trend of influential theory says that strong states with autonomous bureaucracies, trained bureaucrats, well-staffed, resourced, etc., are able to implement this. And then there's a range of comparative historical studies that come to the conclusion that actually not. You don't need strong states. In fact, strong states are often not able to implement policies. What you need is a strong civil society interested in those policies. And then within civil society, there are elite theories that posit that what you really need are elites that are aligned with common and immediate interests in the implementation of that policy. But on the other hand, there's a string of scholarship that says what you need is shelter from elites. You need elites not to intervene in bureaucracies, and you need a bureaucratic culture, which is kind of a weird thing. You need people not interested in pursuing their self-interest, but in pursuing an organizational goal, which, from the standpoint of rational actor theory, is quite irrational. You need very irrational people dedicated to an organization, not themselves. Of course, an organizational goal is political. It can be politicized, and that can shape policy implementation in many ways. So, in short, what I found is that in areas with high land value, we see elite clashing over land use and intervening in the land bureaucracy. This polarized bureaucrats within the bureaucracy and produced failed policy implementation, failed legibility in terms of land titling, cadasters, certifying surveys, and so forth. And areas with low value, elites were not interested in those lands, and that created a shelter from elites and a de facto autonomy for the bureaucracy. And bureaucrats were still partisan, of course, but that partisanship was contained, and they were able to leverage it to collaborate with civil society, essentially offloading bureaucratic tasks onto civil society groups and producing legibility, state performance, implementation. So I look at this in the historical backdrop of colonization of the Brazilian Amazon, which in 1971, the central state acquired this large swath of orange stripes across the Amazon around roads planned, and about half of those were built, and that's where you have the major deforestation axes. It was also a priority area for land reform, and these land reform and colonization projects look kind of like this, of archetypical land legibility project of parcel rectangular plots for families. And then, of course, you had a reaction to that with the creation of indigenous lands, conservation units, and sustainable use settlement projects, sort of to shield agro-deforestation frontier. But in both the old model and still the alternative socio-economic model, you rely on land surveys and land titling, and still a capitalist cycle of, with a land title, you get bank credit, invest in agriculture, repay your loans, get more credit, and so forth. Of course, if these don't work, the program doesn't work. And that's basically what's been happening for 50 years. You get bankrupt smallholders that then need to turn to illicit economies of land cataloging and produce deforestation. Land titling rates have an interesting pattern. It's hard to see, but here you have from 2000 to 2016, nationally and actually regionally in Amazonia, you had this amount. And then after the parliamentary coup in 2016, in 2 years, you produced almost half as much as the previous 16. And during Bolsonaro's government, almost double of the whole beginning of the century. But this doesn't get at interesting subnational variations, which are critical to driving these patterns historically. So there's this INCRA federal land bureaucracy that was responsible for the colonization project and is still responsible for managing most of land in Brazil. And it has regional superintendencies, and here you have the jurisdictions. And each jurisdiction is highly affected by local elites and civil society. They appoint superintendents. They're able to affect what are the policy targets for that region and who the beneficiaries should be. And so I analyzed two superintendencies in detail: Western Pará and Amazonas. They're neighboring. And here you have titling rates across the region. So I focus my attention on the worst performing one, which is Western Pará and Amazonas. And by the way, they have the highest amount of land under settlement projects and so forth. And there's a puzzle because Western Pará was the policy priority area, had strong peasant organizations and elites very much interested in rural land and valuable land. Prior theory would expect that area would get the titling and the legibility policies. And Amazonas was the least priority area. Elites didn't care about rural land, and peasants are quite weak politically there. Yet it succeeded in legibility policies. So I do this subnational comparison using comparative historical methods and ethnographic observations in the land bureaus and rural settlements, 97 interviews, archives, and administrative data. And basically what I found substantially is that, so Pará, Western Pará highlighted here, INCRA became the central and most important agency in the area. It controlled over 80% of this shaded area right here, and you can see the area under administration in orange. It valorized quite a bit with soybeans coming through here. Oh, okay. So, and there were road pavement projects for hydroelectric dams, and here elites clashed quite a bit. New agribusiness groups moved in, clashed with peasant organizations, and environmentalists chose this area as a priority area in Brazil to create new conservation units. And there was this super important plan for the federal government, the BR Sustainable Development Plan. So all of these groups had a consensus on the need for legibility, regularization, titling, but they clashed over who should administer for whom and with what distribution of land. So elites intervened very much in INCRA, and there was high leadership turnover. They had 17 superintendents in 18 years, each leader appointing a new set of managers. This polarized bureaucrats made leaders make politicized, hasty, and technically flawed decisions. Career bureaucrats resisted. There was lots of judicialization, civil suits, accusations of corruption, conflicts. Bureaucrats threatening to kill each other, literally. And so this disrupted the policy production line quite a bit, created a toxic work environment. A lot of bureaucrats abandoned their careers altogether. And it created institution overburden, administrative freeze, capacity loss, and low performance. So Amazonas was kind of the opposite. Rural land was relegated to whatever. by the elites because they were focused on industrial and commercial development in the capital Manaus since the creation of the Special Economic Zone in 1957 and renewed 2003, and there was kind of like a understated consensus amongst regional elites and the federal government that land could be destined for environmental uses in Amazonas. It also produced rural exodus, population loss in the countryside. Peasants are quite politically weak. They can't elect even a single representative to the federal chamber. And what this created was lack of interest in rural land in Amazonas, political weakness for peasants. It provided shelter from elites to the Inca land bureaucracy, and just a general forbearance in the land's institutional field and Inca. Okay, so just to wrap up. So this created a de facto institutional autonomy in Amazonas. Okay, this is contained bureaucratic partisanship and bureaucrats were able to marshal civil society groups for them to undertake bureaucratic work, and created successful legibility policy implementation. And okay, I'm not going to read this. This is the summary of the argument. And so you base two major conditions for policy implementation that I found are shelter from elites and a moderately partisan bureaucratic body that can collaborate with civil society. And unintended outcomes is that political appointments and judicializations of bureaucracy are often backfire and are certainly insufficient conditions for implementation. I guess I read it. Thank you.
Someone already here. Hi, that was a really interesting presentation. Thanks. Maybe I missed something, but when you place legibility as your dependent variable in a sense, sorry, your outcome variable, could you give a little bit more motivation as to why legibility is important? I mean, why it matters and in what sense it matters?
Sure. So having that centralized information is a precondition for the government to undertake precise and further policy implementation, such as zoning, attribution of deforestation fines, for instance, in identifying who owns what parcel, infrastructural development. Basically, any public policy requires information on land for regional, urban, infrastructural development, further economic policies such as credit acquisition by the owner, the occupants themselves. Without a property title, the person can't go to the bank and get credit from mortgage. So all of these things are beyond the legibility policy, but require legibility.
I guess my question follows up from Sharad's, which is that it is an interesting framing that it was a failed legibility, when in fact it could be an intentional failure, because that kind of uncertainty about, title creates like a great opportunity for speculation. So I'm wondering if you, in responding to that, you can contextualize this within also the broader work on, why nations fail, and this debate between extractive versus inclusive institutions, and kind of intentional policy failure.
Right. I think some of the actors I talked about certainly intended that parts of these legibility policies fail, and historically so in Brazil, landholding elites undermined the land bureaucracy since the 19th century. and it has been a weak land. Like different versions of that bureaucracy have been incredibly weak. So there is some of that. But on the other hand, you have agribusiness elites operating locally in Pará that do want titles for themselves, so for them to acquire credit and cheapen lots of processes that they have to go through. So you even have some illegal timber elites that favored settlement creation so that they could launder their timber operations within like a legitimate settlement arrangement. But so I think parts of the legibility umbrella are undermined intentionally, but overall I would say it's an unintended consequence of multiple actors having different interests.
Do one last question over here.
Thank you, Gabriel. One question. It might seem that a high amount of land titling is, or a high rate of land that is titled, is a positive outcome of policy. But to what point, remembering the really high rates when you were showing the graph under the Bolsonaro mandate. So how much has this to do with the buzzword of grillaging? Yeah, like land that is titled, which is from the outset land which was occupied illegally, and it's just an ex post legalization of illegal land occupations, which would be like contrary to a just or a fair policy outcome.
Right. So the rates I showed you are from the land reform program, and there are a series of filters or funnels, if you will, to verify that the receivers of those titles are essentially poor, don't own land elsewhere, and are not public employees, and are registered within the land reform program. So there's that filter, which is pretty robust. There could be some illegitimate people titled. I think that would be a very small minority in that data set. But the interesting thing, I think, is a bit of a dilemma. During the Workers' Party government, they privileged other aspects of the rural development model except titling. And Bolsonaro, Temer first and Bolsonaro even more so, did the exact opposite. Like, let's just title them, let's liberate them, and don't give any other benefits. No housing, credits, road, forget. Let them just fend for themselves, but we'll give them titles and they'll be free. And so I think for a just and sustainable policy within this multi-decade model would be to have both at the same time. You need the title and you need all these other side policies. But you had everything but no titles, and then nothing except titles, and neither works quite well.
Yeah, it's my turn. Thanks again for Yifan and Gabriel for the fantastic presentations, and it's now my pleasure to introduce my talk titled Barriers to Greater Adoption of Remote Sensing Data, Tools, and Products in Tropics. And this is based on a study that I conducted with Elsa Ordway, Kim Carlson, Denise Sanwa, and William Boyd. I'm going to share a little bit about the background and motivation for the study and the methods that we used, and then dive into the results, and then have a quick discussion on two of the main results, and hopefully that transitions us nicely into the Q&A. So, remote sensing can be a critical aspect of a range of governance-related activities in the tropics, like obviously forest monitoring, biodiversity conservation can be, when it is utilized for participatory and counter-mapping efforts, it can inform policy design and be leveraged for law enforcement. So together these activities can play really important roles in establishing efficient, effective, and ideally equitable governance approaches to sustainable land use in the tropics. I do, before I go to that, want to caveat that we kind of heard that earlier, that by having remote sensing capacity, that does not mean that we also have governance. Governance obviously is way bigger than that, and remote sensing is just one of the many pillars that governance rests on, and that is the pillar that we are focusing on with this study. There we go. So over the last 2 decades, remote sensing technology and data technology has advanced enormously, and nowadays we have vast amounts of data and like really high-powered tools that are completely freely available. So maybe the question comes up, it's like, are we good then, right? Maybe we have enough of it all. We were kind of skeptical about this, and in particular, we wanted to hear from people who use remote sensing for governance-related activities on a daily basis on the ground. Civil servants, indigenous and local community members, people who may have less access to resources and are on the frontiers of deforestation in the tropics. So in order to do that, we conducted semi-structured interviews with actors across the entire remote sensing chain, with a focus on civil servants from subnational governments and indigenous peoples and local communities. We used thematic analysis to identify relevant themes from the interview data and then categorize those themes. And in total, we interviewed 38 remote sensing users in 4 categories, including remote sensing data and technology providers, both private companies but also public space agencies, remote sensing facilitating organizations that provide funding or technical expertise to build remote sensing capacity, and then government remote sensing users and non-government remote sensing users, including indigenous and local community members. We identified 6 key challenges from the interview data. That's quality of the data that's accessible, expertise, resources, and infrastructure, retention of staff and institutional knowledge, an institutional mandate or the lack thereof, bureaucracy and regulation, and then finally access and inclusion. And I'm going to be focusing, in the interest of time, on 4 of these in the next couple of slides. The first one being quality of accessible data. And I think our study really corroborates prior research that has found that data quality obviously can be a limiting factor, and that mostly pertains to spatial, spectral, and temporal resolution being insufficient, lack of archival data for time series analyses, and then also high cloud coverage in certain jurisdictions, really limiting the amount of images that are available for the users. We also found that there's just issues with remote sensing products, for example, biomass estimates and deforestation alerts, and the accuracy and the uncertainty of those products varies a lot across different biomes and topographies, making it difficult for some users to really rely on those products. Sorry. There we go. But simultaneously, a lot of the people we talked to also emphasized that we live in a time of abundance of high quality data, like this regional coordinator from a facilitating organization mentioned that we have so much data that that's not the issue. So we have sort of some maybe like opposing streams of responses to this question of available data quality. The second point is expertise, resources, and infrastructure, and I think this is what came up most in the interviews with people, that there's just insufficient technical expertise in acquiring, processing, and applying remote sensing data. I asked a member of a government program in Central Africa what the main challenges that they're facing, and they said lack of capacity for sure. And I think this really often dovetails with lack of financial resources, and then associated with that hardware and software, and those severely undermine the efforts to building capacity and expertise. And we also found that those 2 things, technical expertise and financial resources, vary significantly across geographies and institutional contexts, which, it makes sense, like a private company employee would have more resources available compared to someone working in a non-profit. But also, for example, a civil servant in Brazil is usually better equipped to deal with some of these challenges compared to their counterpart just across the border in Peru. But at the same time, a lot of the interviews also mentioned that there's a lot of technological advancement that can help overcome some of these obstacles, including satellite internet for improved connectivity in remote areas and mobile apps that can bypass the need for desktop computers and the associated skill and hardware and infrastructure necessary to operate this. The third challenge I want to talk about is related to retention of staff and institutional knowledge, and it was something that both, I think, Ivan and Gabriel touched upon. High staff turnover and loss of institutional knowledge are major issues, especially in public institutions and under-resourced organizations. And I think from the interviews we gathered, there's two reasons really for that. And the first one is that elections can be associated with really high rates of staff turnover. In some jurisdictions, up to 90-95% of staff being changed out after an election. And that is coupled with an inadequate documentation and onboarding processes. So the new people coming in don't learn as fast, and then that leads to significant loss of institutional knowledge. As this civil servant from Peru put rather bleakly, if I die tomorrow, all the knowledge goes with me. The challenge is to create a document that has permanence of information. And the second reason we found is that there's simply better financial compensation in the private sector. People acquire skill, which makes them attractive for the job market, and then they leave for more money somewhere else. And I spoke to an indigenous community member, and they mentioned that we're a great place, it seems, for starting out and getting a little bit of experience and then finding a better paying job in the city somewhere else. And that kind of leads me to the fourth challenge around access and inclusion. So on the ground users, particularly civil servants and subnational government, indigenous and local community members, are poorly integrated into the remote sensing value chain. And before I explain what we mean by that, I do want to emphasize that that is not because of a lack of interest on their part. Actually, like this non-government user put it, that they found the community is really interested in using maps to defend their rights and interests. There's a huge enthusiasm for it. So what do we mean by poorly integrated into the remote sensing value chain? For one, there's simply limited access to data and tools, but also to data and tool providers. Like this government user said that data provider has never come down to the subnational level, much less to the local level. It stayed up top. And I think that prevents like the exchange of information. They cannot share their grievances and needs, but it also creates this sentiment of exclusion from this entire process. And the second point is around data privacy and sovereignty, and I think that's particularly pertinent for indigenous communities, and their demand for privacy and sovereignty can be at odds with a lot of the terms and conditions that are associated with data products and funding around open data and open access. So again, a tribal member said that there's a lot of issues with that when it comes to tribal governments. Most of our data will not be public, and this really precludes them from accessing certain government grants and using certain types of data that would require them to make their data publicly available. And I'm going to skip the results summary and go straight into the discussion. And the first point I want to talk about is this kind of idea of democratization of remote sensing. I think there's a discourse going on that the democratization of remote sensing is taking place with all this free and available data. And I think this often focuses on technological challenges like improving data quality, there's more powerful cloud computing, we have machine learning and AI approaches. And I do want to say that these are very powerful and very important, but they often require some amount of existing expertise, some existing infrastructure, and like a supported institutional environment for these advances to take full effect. And I think the discourse around this seems to ignore these non-technical challenges, these institutional challenges that prevent the building of these basic skills in the first place. And I think one reason for this is that these institutional challenges are very difficult to address. And I also think they're less attractive to address and less attractive for investment. So I spoke to a leading employee of a big facilitating organization, and I thought this quote was very nice. They said that it's not something you can throw one big flashy program at, call it the capacity program now with a Californian tech company, and expect results. So they really emphasized that it is just not very attractive for them to work on capacity building and institutional challenges because it's much more difficult to convey that to their donors and organizations who provide support for that. And the second point I wanted to briefly discuss is around access and inclusion. And civil servants, indigenous peoples, and communities are often excluded from the remote sensing value chain. And this really represents a missed opportunity for two-way exchange of information. And I wanted to highlight that this is not coincidental. It's rather rooted in the history of remote sensing as like a Western tool for exploitation of resources, exercise of power, and dispossession. And I think this is a huge missed opportunity for this two-way exchange of information to improve forest monitoring, conservation activities, and a lot of governance-related activities more generally, because we miss out on a lot of cultural and traditional local knowledge. We could explore floral and faunal surveys done by local and indigenous communities, but also, for example, early detection of signs for illegal deforestation, like one non-government user put it very nicely, I think, is that they, meaning the local communities, can announce the deforestation alert before we can detect this with remote sensing. And I think that's something that if we could integrate that into governance approaches, would actually be very powerful. And it's critical that these exchanges, if they do take place, are designed to ensure data sovereignty and fair benefit sharing while addressing these colonial legacies to avoid data extractivism. And I'm just going to jump over these 2 points and end on the 2 points of the conclusion here, that we see these barriers to adopting remote sensing in a greater way vary a lot with geographic and institutional contexts, and they're particularly pronounced for actors in governmental institutions and indigenous and local communities, and that addressing these barriers may require departure from this technical optimist narratives, and that the support of the international community is really needed for establishing conditions that enable these equitable and long-term capacity building efforts that could then lead to a greater adoption of remote sensing in the long term. And I think that's it. Thank you. Well, now I have to bring the microphone and talk. Let's see if I can do that. That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you. All right, here we go.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if in your interviews you also came across that the increasing availability and access of remote sensing data also increases the risk of misappropriate use of remote sensing, because you said it yourself that it can be a very powerful tool for governance, but that might also mean that thereby the blind spots of remote sensing or the things you should not derive from remote sensing data are systematically reinforced in governance. And if this was something that people were aware of or discussing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think I actually, interestingly, did not hear that so much from users on the ground, but rather from people who have maybe a bird's eye view on the remote sensing community and technology, an overview of it. And I think there was an awareness for the misappropriation of the technology. And people did mention that we need to be very in how we are employing it. Talking to folks on the ground, they were way more concerned with practical efforts. I mean, sometimes we don't have internet, we don't have computers, we don't have anyone interested in doing this job, we don't have funding. So I think that required a certain level of abstraction, maybe, that people who are struggling to build the basic capacity weren't even worried about yet. But at a higher level, people were definitely mentioning that and pointed it out as an absolutely legitimate risk for sure.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, and introduce myself. So I'm Priska Kwaku from the University of Cambridge. About the barriers related to remote sensing and decision at the governmental level, especially in developing countries in Africa. One of your results was related to lack of expertise, resource, and infrastructure. And yeah, it's obvious and everyone is talking about it. But my questions was mostly related to, have you explored any potential solutions, practical solutions related to this issue, especially from the point of view of the people you interviewed, and also from your personal reflections.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't really have time to put recommendations in the presentation, but in talking to the users, definitely a lot of recommendations from their end came up. In the case of Central African users that I spoke to, one of the things around funding, for example, was that they proposed that the agencies responsible for remote sensing or Earth observation should be restructured so that they can autonomously raise funding and not only reliant on their own government funding, because they experience a lot of either like disinterest around remote sensing or seeing that their higher ups in the organization don't really understand the benefits of investing in remote sensing. So their proposal was to enable them to acquire partnerships and international funding autonomously to then build out their capacity. So that was one of the approaches they mentioned. Another one was to integrate remote sensing into the school curriculum in like some way or another, because they also struggled to find people who have like basic skills in order to then learn remote sensing. So that was another proposal that came up. And I think a third one was to really build strategic partnerships with partners that are in it for the long run. I think that was a big one that came up, that people complained that, partners would come into the country, set up like some kind of short-term program for capacity development and leave. And they really emphasized that if they could have partners that are committed to stay for a really long time and are able to combat the staff turnover and those kinds of issues, that would be really helpful. So I think that would be like 3 things that come to my mind right now.
I'm not sure how much more time we have.
Like 30 seconds.
Sure. Actually, this is going to be more food for thought since we have 30 seconds. But anyways, thank you so much. I really appreciate your methods, especially asking people about what's not working is a wonderful way to really find solutions. I appreciate it. This actually relates to both the previous presentation as well. But I think there seems to be an assumption in both of your work about the fact that people will be empowered by being legible. And I want to just push back on that a little bit. And I think you did have a quote in one of your interviews for indigenous community or civil society organization that said, we don't want to be legible, right? We don't want to share our data. I think it's really important to question that assumption, right? Is that by being legible, people who are powerless or have less power will be made empowered by being legible. So anyways, if you have some reflections, I know we're out of time, but that's just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, I think I don't have like a sophisticated answer to that on the top of my head. It was just something that in my interviews, there was more enthusiasm about having access to it rather than like critical reflection. So that would be. So that's just the one kind of sentiment that I could say to that. But I think it's a really valid point that needs to be considered when doing these kinds of studies. Sure.
All right, so this slide presentation involves a lot of builds and diagrams, and it's boding badly from the first slide. Yeah, fonts haven't worked out, but anyway. So, what are forest-focused supply chains policies? These are policies adopted by companies voluntarily to try and reduce deforestation or eliminate deforestation in their supply chains. Many household names have adopted commitments to zero deforestation, companies you might recognize in the slide. And these policies often apply to the so-called forest risk commodities, which include cattle, palm oil, soy, and cocoa. And we actually know quite a lot now about how effective these policies are. The answer is they are a bit effective. They're kind of moderately effective. A lot of research has looked at this. But there is a remaining question about whether they're actually fair for smallholder farmers who stand at risk of being excluded from supply chains if they're unable to comply. And we also don't really know that much about what factors influence the design of these policies and therefore might influence their effectiveness and equity in turn. And so this is exactly what we're addressing in this project, which involves a number of different pieces of research led by Rachel. It's called Forest Policy. And in this particular piece, we are trying to understand what conditions influence the effectiveness and the equity of these forest-focused supply chain policies. And we're interested in particular in public governance arrangements, so public policies, and then the arrangements in the value chains themselves. So we're looking across the tropics at the 4 commodities I mentioned, looking at Brazil, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Indonesia. And these diagrams are not going to work, I'm certain. So we conducted over 200 semi-structured interviews within our group. Joyce is also here, who's also contributed to interviews to this. And we've kind of developed this, I say analytical framework, but really this is a thematic framework. We're trying to identify what are the themes within each of these kind of categories that we're interested in. So the public governance context, also the general characteristics of the sectors where we're conducting this research, these 4 commodities, and then the value chain arrangements that I mentioned. And then we're trying to link those through process tracing to the design features of forest-focused supply chain policies that we can see. And some of these concepts we're drawing inductively from the interviews themselves, and some of them we're drawing on existing theory. So we're drawing heavily on value chain governance theory. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the actual specifics of the theories that we're drawing on, but also we have some frameworks now for understanding what makes a well-designed forest-focused supply chain policy, published by Rachel and also Inina Grabs and other members of our group. So we're drawing on that framework to understand ex ante the likely effectiveness and equity of these policies. And today I'm just going to focus really on palm oil in Indonesia and cocoa in West Africa. And also I'm going to really be thinking more about the value chain linkages. So, okay, this kind of works. Although I think these are the old slides. So, okay, we had a new slide set. So I'm going to try and skip through these. Sorry, bear with me here. Right, okay, I think I can start here. So basically, the first thing to say is, in terms of the public governance context in each country, there are kind of 2 major differences that I just wanted to talk about today. One is the legality of deforestation. So in Indonesia, that's really governed by this land zoning arrangement, whereas in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, it's more focused on protected areas. So deforestation is illegal in protected areas and legal outside. And there's also quite a different production system in each country. So in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the system is primarily dominated, well, almost exclusively dominated by smallholder farmers with farms of around 1 to 3 hectares. Whereas in Indonesia, there's this kind of more mixed system of production where there's also a lot of large industrial producers, some of whom might be managing concessions of thousands of hectares. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is this, and I'm sorry, my slides completely messed up, but what I wanted to talk about was the polarity of governance within the value chain. So which firms within the value chain are driving the adoption of these forest-focused supply chain policies? And to a kind of greater extent, it seems that the polarity of governance is slightly different in the cocoa value chain, where consumer goods manufacturers, chocolate manufacturers are driving the adoption of these policies, compared to this palm oil supply chain, where the big traders at the middle of the value chain are driving these policies. And another thing I wanted to say, which would have been in my nice build, was these value chains generally have this kind of hourglass structure. So if you're sitting at the middle of the value chain, then hypothetically you should have more control over what goes on within it. And I think that actually is influencing something that we're seeing about the scope of the policies to whom they apply. So in the case of the cocoa sector, where manufacturers are really driving the adoption of FSPs, the exporters at the middle of the value chain who are trying to satisfy those customer demands are really only applying the FSPs in the value chain necessary to service those customers. Whereas in the palm oil value chain, where the FSPs are more driven by the traders in the middle of the value chain, the FSP's scope is kind of applying to everyone who serves them. So even though they're not necessarily successful in applying the FSP policy to everyone in the value chain, they're at least trying more, it seems, from the interviews, than the exporters in the cocoa sector are. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the nature of the linkages between the different nodes of the value chain. So I did have quite a nice slide where I was going to explain how these actually work, but you can just think about linkages between actors in the value chain as falling on a spectrum from very, very simple market-based linkages where you have simple transactions, high capacity of suppliers to meet the demands of their purchasers, and also low complexity of transactions. And that would be a kind of market-based linkage. So you don't really need to have any relationship with the firm you're buying from. At the other end of the spectrum, we might have a very, very complex transaction required. It might be really difficult to codify the information that's necessary in that transaction, and your suppliers might not really have the capacity to meet that. And in that case, quite often see that firms will actually incorporate their suppliers into them so they can kind of manage them themselves. So that would be an integrated company which does plantation management, it does processing or milling, it does trading as well. And for forest-focused supply chain policies, which are not codified in certification schemes, so kind of policies that go beyond certification schemes, our interview suggests that it's really important that there are at least relational linkages between value chain actors. So even if there is not a kind of captive relationship between a supplier and a buyer, they must have a good relationship between the two. And this has quite important implications for smallholders who do not necessarily have the capacity to meet the requirements of the value chain. There are also maybe millions of them. There are around 2 million smallholders, I believe, in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana producing cocoa. And there are just too many to have strong relationships with. So in the case of the cocoa sector, these smallholders are just getting excluded from the value chain. And that's actually quite different to what's happening in the palm oil sector, where the traders are actually doing their best to incorporate smallholders in the value chain. And that produces a kind of two different outcomes for effectiveness and equity. So where you're trying to include the smaller holders in the supply chain, even though there's so many of them, they don't have the capacity necessary to comply, you have to do a lot of work to build their capacity, you actually might then get a trade-off between the effectiveness of a policy in terms of reducing deforestation and its equity in terms of including those smallholders who are more difficult to include. And this was what was more or less what was published by Union Grabs in her paper, which was using a subset of this data set, the palm oil data. Meanwhile, in the cocoa sector, actually we're just seeing low effectiveness and low equity for two reasons. The first one is that the scope of the policies doesn't cover the whole sector. So the scope of the policy only covers direct sourcing. It's something that Erasmus Ermgassen covered in the kind of bifurcation of these markets. But then secondly, we're having low equity as well, because smallholders that are in protected areas that can't comply are just excluded. And not only those smallholders, but also smallholders who are in buffer zones, who cannot even participate in cooperatives to participate in these value chains, because they're too close to a high-risk protected area. So there was also less text on the slide that I finally developed this one. But what does this all tell us? Well, firstly, I think forest-focused supply chain policies that go beyond certification schemes entail complex transactions that demand at least relational linkages between suppliers. And also the scope and the stringency of forest-focused supply chain policies seems to be linked in some ways to the polarity of governance. So together it seems that the public governance context and the value chain arrangements and the supply chain policies themselves are kind of co-shaping one another. So those contextual factors are shaping the FSPs, and the FSPs then in turn are shaping the linkages in the supply chain, let's say, in terms of them being relational. So generalized approaches to deforestation-free value chain governance, like the EU deforestation regulation, might come up against challenges because there are such differences in the structures of these value chains, which produce different implications for smallholder participation, effectiveness, and equity. And in general, equity for smallholder farmers, particularly those who are unable to comply, is more or less completely unaddressed, is what I'm seeing from the interviews. And I think I'll leave it there. So thanks for bearing with me and the not quite perfect slides. And I also just want to say again, thanks to everyone who participated in this. It's been a truly collaborative team effort. Field work across 3 continents and many people in the room. So thank you, everyone.
Questions for Joss, if also any questions you can ask us.
Just a quick one. Thank you for the presentation, and it worked out with the slides summary. What's the role of the demand in this? Because especially with like pushing for equity, we know some chocolate factory or producers do it now in Europe. But what about, like, I think the consideration for the user is still very much deforestation oriented and not really equity. So do you see any changes there?
I think that's a great question. How to answer it kind of most precisely. Demand is really important. There actually, what I would have liked to go into had there been more time was the different nature of instruments they adopted to implement deforestation-free policies. There's great variation in the cocoa sector. And based on the interviews, it seems that this variation is according to the demand in different markets, and which consumer goods manufacturers are more focused on those markets. So Mondelez focuses more on Europe, for example. Mars focuses more on the Asian and Latin American market, and that produces differences in the instruments they adopt. And also, that will then entail differences in the design of the policies with respect to what they cover, whether they cover only deforestation, whether they cover child labour, living income, and so on. So demand does play an important role, but I think it's kind of mediated by the companies themselves. And a lot of the design policies is about reputation management and risk management, less so responding to consumer demand. I hope that answers the question.
Hello, thank you. I'm Margaret Owuor. I'm a professor at the University of Bern in Integrated Biodiversity Conservation. I'm from Kenya. I liked your model that was indicating about cooperatives, but I was wondering what is the position of corruption? Because also in cooperatives there are a lot of inequality within it, but in your framework it looked like it was the best option that helps a bit, or not?
Yeah.
It doesn't work in the coffee industry and tea industries in Kenya. It's a mess.
So, I didn't actually want to imply any kind of value judgment in terms of what was best in terms of the kind of production and the value chain. In Côte d'Ivoire, where cooperatives are much more prominent than in Ghana, they're regulated by the Conseil Café Cacao, but actually they're in the kind of constitution of the cooperatives. The cooperatives that are involved in the forest-focused supply chain policies are in some way captive to the traders and the consumer goods manufacturers. They often will second staff to those cooperatives to help them implement the policies. There are many different cooperatives that are not even necessarily running according to cooperative structures. They're more kind of shells selling cocoa. And those are not the sorts of cooperatives that I think would be participating in the value chains where companies try and implement these policies. So I think that the points you've raised, I think they're very, very much present in these value chains. I wouldn't say that a cooperative structure is necessarily the best one, that there was not going to be any value chain, so any value judgment made about that. But yeah, that definitely seems to be an issue.
Thanks so much for the presentation and actually for the project. It's really important work and appreciate it. The question was a clarification. I apologize if I missed it, but you said a couple times that there are instruments that go beyond certification. Could you just talk a little bit about what that means and looks like on the ground?
Okay, so these forest-focused supply chain policies are sort of unilateral policies adopted by companies where they're maybe trying to differentiate themselves in the market. They may be trying to differentiate themselves in some particular respect. So pretty much all of the cocoa companies use Rainforest Alliance and or Fairtrade. They also all have their own programs where they do additional community development. They might have a in the case of Nestle, for example, has a project in the Cavalli classified forest where it's doing forest restoration. And they're doing these projects really to kind of differentiate themselves, whether they're a trader that's trying to gain access to customers at the consumer goods level, whether they're consumer goods manufacturers trying to put a label on their product or whatever. So in general, forest-focused supply chain policies have often gone beyond certification standards because many of those in the past didn't include zero deforestation. Now many of them do. So there's not always like one-to-one alignment between the policies and the certification standards, but often they go beyond. Right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, we're at time. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I think that was a wonderful session. I think maybe, at least I'm happy to stick around a little bit if you have questions, but I think otherwise it is also time for lunch. Again, thank you all so much and looking forward to continuing the conversations in the next couple of days.